I want to extend a warm welcome to all of our distinguished guests, in particular, Holocaust survivors and their families. Also, parliamentarians, ambassadors, and rabbis. I'd like to welcome as well, there's somebody's cell phone, if you wouldn't mind turning that off. I'd like to welcome as well the partners in this event, the Embassy of Israel, the National Holocaust Monument Council, the Max and Tessie Zelikovitz Center for Jewish Studies at Carleton University, and Library and Archives Canada. This afternoon, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau officially inaugurated the National Holocaust Monument next to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and tonight's special event honors this inauguration. It's presented by the Centre for Holocaust Education and Scholarship, which is based at Carleton University's Zelikovitz Center. The center was established less than 2 years ago, on the eve of the anniversary of Kristallnacht. It symbolizes the commitment to continue to transmit the stories and to honor the legacy of the Holocaust. The center strives to organize thoughtful and inspirational programs about one of the worst genocides in human history, and tonight's program will be no exception. I'd like to invite Dr. Guy Berthiaume, the head of Library and Archives Canada, up to say a few words. Dr. Berthiaume.
Thank you, Mr. Wall. We usually say tough act to follow, but I would say tough voice to follow. Good evening, welcome. Let me first acknowledge that we're gathered here tonight on the traditional land of the Algonquin people. I'm both proud and humbled to be here in the shadow of a monument which is itself filled with shadows. Shadows of the past, shadows of some of the darkest moments in the world's history, shadows of the victims of the Holocaust. Yet, there's a light which shines through it all, the light of hope. It is the hope of a better future that brings us together tonight. But that doesn't mean that we have to forget what happened before. This monument, much like an archive, refuses the comfort of what must never be forgotten. There are many here tonight who are the second-generation Holocaust survivors, and for them, this monument will have a double meaning, revealing the stories within the stories. Their stories tell us not only about the horrors, but about the strength and determination which allowed survivors and their children to prosper and overcome the many challenges they faced. By erecting this national monument, we give voice to their loss and demonstrate hope for the future, not only for the second generation of Holocaust survivors, but for all those who have been oppressed. We've already seen how trauma can cross generations with Canada's Indigenous peoples and with refugees who have fled their homes and risked everything to start a new life here. We all yearn to draw out the stories that tell us who we are and where we came from. I witness this on a daily basis at Library and Archives Canada because the biggest single attraction of our records is family history. So, by erecting this monument in the heart of Ottawa's Cultural Centre, we ensure that families continue to tell and preserve their stories. This way, we safeguard our own very humanity. And since LEC is only steps away, it'll be easy for those inspired by the Holocaust Monument to find out more by visiting our collections and speaking with our staff. So, welcome tonight, welcome every day of the year to your library and archives. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Berthiaume. I'd like to invite Shlomit Sufa, the Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy of Israel, to come up and say a few words on behalf of the Embassy.
Bonsoir. Honored survivors, Dr. Robert Krell, Rabbi Daniel Friedman, National Holocaust Monument Development Council, Mesdames et Messieurs. I would like to begin by thanking the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship for organizing tonight's event. Thank you also to the Government of Canada and members of Parliament, both past and present, for all the work they've done in turning a community's vision into reality, and for their commitment to Holocaust education, fighting anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hatred in all its forms. I would be remiss if I did not thank Mrs. Laura Grossman for her determination and unfailing commitment to the creation of the monument. Earlier today, I was honored to attend the unveiling of the National Holocaust Monument, and I'm still deeply moved by the ceremony and the speakers. Today and every day, the monument reminds us of the darkest chapter in human history and stands as a somber tribute to those killed by the Nazis and their collaborators. Tonight's testimonies, coupled with the establishment of a national monument, are true reflections of this country's dedication to enshrining the memory and lessons of Holocaust and into its nation's consciousness and heart. As Dr. Robert Krell writes in his memoir, Holocaust education provides a warning, one too easily ignored, but a warning nonetheless. Tonight's event is an affirmation of Dr. Krell's words and a commitment to future generations. I'm honored to stand here as a representative of the State of Israel, the Jewish people monument of hope and revival, the place that holds the perished deep in its heart, and like the monument unveiled earlier today, is forever committed to the preservation of their memory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Soufa. This afternoon's inauguration was significant for more than one reason. It means that Ottawa can now join other capitals in the Western world in having a Holocaust monument. Canada was a standout, unfortunately, in that category for not having one up until now. This is an important occasion for Canada, for Ottawa, and for everyone involved in making this National Holocaust Monument a reality. The Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship is pleased to present the video From Vision to Reality in cooperation with the National Monument Council. The program will give us a better understanding of the story behind the creation of the Holocaust Monument. It will also allow us to honor the survivors who made Canada their home and who have helped us through their eloquent and moving testimonies to gain a better understanding of the Holocaust. The idea for this monument was conceived 10 years ago by Laura Grossman. At the time, she was a student at the University of Ottawa. It was her initiative, and drive that made this monument a reality. It is an incredible story unto itself. If you heard All in a Day this afternoon, you would have heard Laura speaking about it just after the 5:30 news. This is the largest and most complex new monument in Ottawa in about 70 years. It was designed by the renowned architect Daniel Libskin and his team. The National Holocaust Monument was established by the Government of Canada through the National Holocaust Monument Act and through generous donations by numerous contributors from across Canada. I'd like to invite Shimon Fogel. He is the CEO of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs to come up and say a few words. Shimon.
The benefit of coming later in the program is you can strike off the people who've already been mentioned and recognized, and you can contract your remarks, which I think will be welcome to all. We at CEJ are delighted to join with Chess and all the other sponsors of this evening's program. For me, there's an added dimension of this evening being special insofar as I'm a child of survivors too, as some in the room, and as a second generation, the words tonight I think are going to resonate in a very special way. I do want to take just a quick moment to acknowledge Deidre Butler, professor at Carleton, who heads up the Zelikovic Center, and in particular Mina Cohn, who we at CEJA have begun to work much more closely with over the past while, because their efforts really translate into action the commitment and the promise that flowed from the Holocaust experience. And I would be remiss, I know it's always dangerous to point out individuals, but I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the presence of the Honorable David Kilgore, who, for many of us, represents the determination of never again translated into action, not just for the Jewish community, but certainly for Jews threatened various places around the world, but to all communities who are under assault. And it's great to see him here this evening, and we wish him great strength in continuing his noble mission over the coming years. We've all either participated in or are keenly aware of the historic event that occurred earlier in the day, the unveiling of the National Holocaust Monument, and it really is indeed a very special milestone in Canadian history and in the Jewish community's history here in Canada. But monuments are not a new thing to our tradition. We go back into the Bible and we see several examples of monuments that were erected to represent something significant that had to be carried forward. There's the famous one of Jacob marking the place where he had the dream about angels on his way to ultimately his father-in-law Laban's house. But you also have, on his return to the land of Israel, a monument that is erected by him and his father-in-law, with whom he doesn't have the most comfortable relationship, that is meant to serve as a signal for future generations. And similarly, when the Jews, at the completion of their exodus from Egypt, return in with Joshua into the land of Israel, there is a very dramatic event that occurs on two mountains that actually exist, and on your next trip to Israel, your tour guide should take you to see those two mountains. But in advance of that, there are stones that are erected to mark the moment when they pass from slavery into peoplehood. And so too, this monument is meant not just to represent a marker for something that happened, but an expression of our collective commitment about the future. And when one reflects on the Canadian journey that the Prime Minister earlier today noted has some black marks in it, like the experience of the St. Louis. And we think back of our experience over the last 2 years and the way in which we as a country have welcomed in to our midst, to our homes, to our communities, those who were at risk, who were unsafe, and in particular those in the Middle East, victims of terrible, terrible bloodshed. We are declaring that we have taken to heart the lesson of the Holocaust, never again. And every time somebody goes and drives by that monument, or they go and visit it adjacent to the War Museum, they too will be giving expression to that ongoing commitment that we have the capacity to make things better and we have the obligation to do so. So as we mark this event, and as we take to heart the words that we're going to hear over the course of this evening, I join with you in celebrating the passage from the St. Louis to the monument and to all that it represents for our determination to make things better in the days, the months, the years, and the decades ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shimon. Rabbi Daniel Friedman has served Beth Israel Synagogue in Edmonton for 15 years. He is the longest-serving rabbi in Western Canada. Rabbi Friedman is the chair of the National Holocaust Monument Council of Canada and the representative of the Orthodox Jewish community on faith in Canada's prestigious Cabinet of Canadians. He holds advanced judicial ordination from Rabbi G.D. Schwartz of the Bet Din of America and is a doctoral candidate in international relations at the University of Alberta. I'd like to invite Rabbi Friedman to come up and say a few words on behalf of the National Holocaust Monument Council. Rabbi, if you please.
Thank you to Mina and the Center for inviting me to speak here this evening. It's really been a momentous day, a historic day for all Canadians, and to top it off here in such a warm room, a full overflowing room, is just so special. I think one of the most striking moments earlier today at the unveiling of the Holocaust Monument was when our beloved Prime Minister got out of his seat, headed a few rows back, spotted Tim Uppal. Tim Uppal is a former member of Parliament, no longer serves in the current government, spotted him towards the back, pulled him to the front, and he says, "Tim, you need to be sitting right up here, right at the center of it all." At the end of the event, the Prime Minister turns around, gives Tim a hug, and says, "Tim, you started all of this." For those who don't know, Tim Uppal was the rookie backbencher MP who, before he was a minister, was the one who initiated the Holocaust Monument Bill. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I've been asked this evening to tell the story of how the monument came together, and I'm going to do that and provide some highlights. But the story actually begins with Tim a couple of decades ago. You see, Tim's wife, Kiran. For those who don't know Tim, you would have spotted him today had you been there. Tim has a long beard and a turban. Tim is Sikh. His wife, Kiran, also Sikh. Kiran went to Catholic school, and Kiran had many Jewish friends. Sikh girl, Catholic school, Jewish friends. Kiran is 16 years old, and her Jewish friends at Catholic school say to their Sikh friend, "We're going on the March of the Living. How about, would you like to join us?" Kiran says, "Okay, sounds interesting." After she goes on the March of the Living, she develops a relationship with Rabbi Bulka, and till today, she calls Rabbi Bulka her rabbi. Sikh girl, Catholic school, Jewish friends, has a rabbi. When I tell the story this evening about the Holocaust Monument, I'm going to look at three aspects. Number one, the process, what exactly took place, how Ottawa came to have this incredible monument. Secondly, what the point is of a monument. I mean, why do we not need a monument? What's the point? What does it achieve? What's it all about? And number three, as I've kind of preempted, there are a lot of little miracles that have taken place along the way that show the power of the individual and the power of what we as each and every one of us can achieve. It's not just about big, huge monuments and $100,000 donations and $8.5 million structures. It's about individuals. Some of you might have heard Laura Grossman's story. She was interviewed a number of times today in various media outlets. I'm going to just give it briefly because it's the beginning of the story. Laura Grossman was a University of Ottawa student who sat in her class as a freshman, hearing that we were the only allied nation in the world without a Holocaust monument in the capital. And she says, that's crazy. Well, how could that be? And she began her journey, her relentless pounding of the pavement to change our narrative, to change our history. First of all, she turned to CJA employee and former member of parliament, Richard Marceau. Together they created a list of whom to approach in each party who might be interested, who might buy into this. They gathered images and stories of monuments from around the world, and they decided that this would only happen if they had all cross-party support. But in her words, she was laughed out of many a parliamentarian's office, and she was laughed out of many a Jewish community leader's office. Who was this young buck thinking that, it was not as if it had not been tried in the past. And who did she think that she was that she could achieve it? Clearly, this 18-year-old with a dream was not someone that I, as a parliamentarian, am going to stake my reputation and my career on. But then, little by little, people started listening. In 2007, Richard and Laura introduced the bill for the first time. Unfortunately, it didn't come to pass. An election was called, and they had to start the process all over again. With the new government, the Honourable Peter Kent became a major supporter. And in 2008, when he became a cabinet minister, he decided that he was going to drive this. But as a cabinet minister, he could not initiate the bill on his own. It needed to be a new MP, a backbencher MP, and so they turned to Tim Appel, Sikh member of parliament from Alberta, who decided, yes, I will do this. Now, I'm going to come back to my story now with Kiran, because, who would have thought 20 years prior that Sikh girl, Catholic school, Jewish friends, off to the March of the Living would in any way have an impact, have ramifications on the story of Canada decades later. So when this bill was brought to Tim, it wasn't news to him. He had heard of the Holocaust. He knew that his wife spoke about the horrors that she had witnessed, and he said, absolutely. You see, backbenchers get that one opportunity to initiate a new piece of legislation. He said, if this is going to be my opportunity, I want to do this Holocaust monument. This is going to be my legacy. Absolutely. At the same time, former Prime Minister Harper strongly got behind the bill. He mentioned the Holocaust monument in a speech from the throne, and the first reading in Parliament passed easily. It got held up a little at the committee level, and then finally, when it did make it back to the Senate, it did pass through. But then, much to the chagrin of Laura and Richard and others, it became clear that a new election was about to be called. Nevertheless, they did get it through. The bill was passed, and the third and final reading happened in the Senate on Thursday, May 24th, 2011, where it was unanimously passed. Bill C-442, an act to establish a National Holocaust Memorial, was signed into law by the Governor General at 8 a.m. on May 25th, 2011, and Prime Minister Harper triggered an election hours later. During that period of the government, the 40th Parliament, there were 448 private member bills that were introduced. Only 4 became law. The National Holocaust Monument was one of those. How did I get involved? You see, Tim Appel, Kiran Appel, might have had some connection to the Jewish community going back years. But Tim was an MP for Sherwood Park. Anybody here been to Sherwood Park? Okay, a few of you have been to Sherwood Park. Sherwood Park is not one of the major cities of Canada. Sherwood Park is a town outside of Edmonton where there are very few Jewish inhabitants. We have a couple of members of our shul who do live in the Sherwood Park district, but not a lot of Jews there, maybe a handful. And we heard, it made national news that Tim Uppel, MP for Sherwood Park, had initiated this bill, it had passed, and I says, well, what sort of recognition is he getting in his constituency? Probably zero, because there's not a lot of interest in Sherwood Park about a Holocaust monument. I says, we're the nearest Jewish community. We should be giving him a little honor. So we called him out. We says, we'd like to honor you at a kiddush at the synagogue. He says, what's a kiddush? So, of course, he was tickled pink that we had invited him, and I said to him, look, we're not going to be able to take photos. Would you like to come a day or two before for the photo shoot? He said he would love to. So he came on the Thursday or Friday. We had the photo shoot. He came again on the Shabbat. We honored him at the Kiddush, and the relationship began then. Actually, already then at the Kiddush, one of the senior members of the shul whispered into Tim's ear, how do we get Rabbi Friedman onto the council? And Tim said, well, it's early days. We don't know what's going to happen, how things will turn out, but we'll certainly keep that in mind. As things did unfold, and as the rules were written up as to how it would happen, it became clear that there would be a 5-member council appointed across Canada. And at that point, Tim mentioned my name. The appointments were going to be made by former Minister of Foreign Affairs, John Baird, and Tim, along with Ronna Ambrose, who was at the time our Member of Parliament, mentioned my name to former Minister Baird, and I became involved. I was chosen to be a member of the council. When the council came together, I was, shall I say, one of the younger members of the council. All right, you saw everybody sitting with me today. Okay, I'm a little drop younger than most of the members of the council. And so I sat there really humbly, just doing my thing, willing to learn from these greats of the Jewish community how one goes about building a Holocaust monument. And as we sat there and we realized that this is something that is its own institution, it had to have its own tax number, its own board, as it were. Who's going to head it up? And each one looked at the other and said, not me, I have all of these other commitments. Not me, I have this commitment, that commitment. I said, I'll do it. 30-something-year-old young fella out from really little Edmonton. Edmonton's a big city, it's not a big Jewish community. Sometimes we think of ourselves out west as sizable representations, but compared to some of the communities here, along with Toronto, Montreal, we're a small Jewish community. And so to think that I might be heading up this Holocaust monument was really something that I'd never considered, and the Almighty sent it my way. And when something comes your way that the Almighty sends you, you raise your hand and you say, I'd like to be a part of this. So the first thing that we did, we were asked by the government to choose a site for the monument. We looked at a number of different sites that the National Capital Commission had designated for the monument. The first one we looked at is right up there, next to Parliament Hill, next to the Supreme Court building. And there is a beautiful, perfect spot that would be in the center of it all. But anybody that's been onto that property will know there's something there where the smoke rises from something that's happening underneath. And we said, nah, it's not going to work. And there were debates. There were debates both at a council level and at more senior government levels as to whether it could be incorporated. And a couple of us said, absolutely not. That would be highly inappropriate. And if anyone in any way would be offended by the way that it had been done, it would defeat the purpose. I give you that story. We looked at a lot of sites. The site that was chosen that you saw today unveiled for the monument, it's important to note that a lot went into it. A lot went into the decision, and finally we chose that made sense right there next to the War Museum. But these decisions didn't happen overnight. These decisions were well thought out, well processed, and came along with a lot of negotiations. We then had a visioning session with experts and survivors from across Canada to determine what is the purpose of our monument. I'll get to in a few moments what the purpose of monuments is in general, and Holocaust monuments in particular, but each monument tells its own story. So what story were we trying to tell? And the committee decided that the purpose of the monument was threefold. Number one, to remember the victims of the German Nazi genocide. Number two, to honor the contributions of survivors to Canadian society. And number three, to symbolize our Canadian commitment to eternally stand at the forefront of combating bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, wherever they rear their ugly heads. We were then tasked with building this monument to reflect that. So the way it was designed by the National Capital Commission, we needed a jury, and a jury of experts was chosen from across Canada to determine who would be the design team. That jury was made up of designers, architects, Holocaust survivors, experts in every field. Requests for qualifications were then sent out by the NCC for potential design teams, went out to all the major architectural magazines, went out to anyone that we thought may express an interest in this, and we received 73 applications to design the monument. It was narrowed down to 6 finalists, and then the jury decided, after a public showing that many of you may have seen, those 6 final designs that were on display at the War Museum. Finally, the design was chosen. It was a design by the Lord cultural team from Toronto, but featuring the design of Daniel Libeskind, that some of us heard his explanation today. And I want to tell you, the design from the Lord team from Libeskind stood out head and shoulders above all of the other designs. It was really something special. And anyone that's familiar with any of the other monuments, Holocaust monuments throughout the world, will attest to the fact that this is our monument. Our monument really stands head and shoulders above the great monuments of the world today. We have a number of aspects. Some of you might have seen there's a visual aspect. One of the members of the team, Edward Batinsky, went back to the killing sites, took a number of photos. Those photos have been incorporated into the walls of the monument in a form of paint photographic artwork. The monument features various areas, an area for reflection, an area that shows us that one doesn't know who one is when one is walking through columns of concrete and you're not quite sure where to go next. And finally, as one walks up these stairs or takes the elevator, you get a direct line to the Peace Tower to be able to show that this is about where Canada is heading, that we stand at this forefront of fighting anti-Semitism and racism. But along the way, as we raised the money, various issues did come up. Issues such as security, issues such as snow removal, questions of threats, risk assessment, how were those to be dealt with, questions that we hadn't considered, questions that we didn't know we were getting ourselves into when we first thought that we were simply fundraising for this monument. But all of these pieces of the puzzle were shepherded by the amazing council that I had the great merit to work alongside with and to learn from. As I say, most of the council members are more senior than myself, and I have learned an incredible amount from both my council members and all of the experts that we have worked with over the last number of years. What is a monument? Why is it important? The foremost expert on Holocaust monuments in the world is Dr. James Young. His monumental work is called The Texture of Memory. And there are different debates around monuments in general, debates around Holocaust monuments. There's a critical view that says that when we create a Holocaust monument, bricks and mortar allow us to forget. Why? Because until now, we have to remember. Zachor. Once we translate that memory into bricks and mortar, it takes the onus off of ourselves. And so there are those who criticize Holocaust monuments and say that maybe we should not have them exist, to which we answer two things. Number one, unfortunately, today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Krell. We're going to hear other survivor testimonies. Unfortunately, the first-hand testimonies that we will hear today, my grandchildren will not have that merit. And so we need some way to be able to concretize the message of the Holocaust to the next generation. That's number one. Number two is that this notion that we remember the Holocaust and perhaps we're shifting that responsibility, that onus onto bricks and mortar is not a given. It's not a given. It's not a given. We only need look around ourselves in Europe, North America today to know that there are many that have long since forgotten the lessons of the Holocaust, and many that never even knew them to begin with. And when we are dealing, Shimon mentioned this, the Prime Minister mentioned, when we're dealing with a country where at one stage had a policy of none is too many, it's not a given that this is part of our national memory, collective memory. It's only when we give it some sort of form that we can constantly remind ourselves that that was not acceptable, that the correct approach is to be standing at the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism, prejudice, bigotry, racism everywhere. What a Holocaust monument achieves, says Dr. Young, is that it creates a sense of shared values, of common memory. Common memory may sometimes mean that we didn't all share that memory, but now that memory has been created as that common national memory. A Holocaust monument, says Dr. Young, is complicated because monuments need to fit in with the landscape, and at the same time, the Holocaust monument needs to be jarring. It needs to be in our faces. It needs to remind us loud and clear of our obligations. How do you combine that? I think that the Liebeskind Lord team have done an awesome job of combining, joining, making it blend in with the Canadian War Museum, but there's no way that anyone can drive past the Holocaust monument and not ask oneself, what's it doing there? How did it come about? What's my responsibility? What does it mean to me? The third aspect that I mentioned about the personal stories. I mentioned Laura Grossman, an 18-year-old student at the University of Ottawa. I mentioned Kiran Appel, a high school student who went on the March of the Living. I mentioned myself, who was entrusted by leaders of our Canadian community, leaders of the Jewish community, entrusted to be the chair of this monument. An awesome responsibility that warms my heart till today. I can't be grateful enough for being entrusted with such a huge responsibility. But I mention those because it's important, if we're passing on a message to the next generation, to recognize that each young person can move worlds, that we never know where a Kiran Appel will end up in 20 years' time. A Sikh girl. We have here in Canada so many different faiths, so many different walks of life, ethnicities, groups, demographics. And if we believe in each of our young people, and we believe that they can make a difference and they will make a difference, and that when we entrust them with the message, entrust them with the values of who we are as Canadians, and instill them with those values, I promise you, we will see the next Laura Grossmans. We will see the next Kieran and Tim Apples. We'll see the next Dan Friedmans. Young people, next generation people, who will change the course, change the narrative, change our entire value system here in Canada for the better, continue on that evolution of allowing us to stand at the helm, to lead the world in fighting prejudice. We've just begun the new year, the year 5778, which in Hebrew is Taf Shin Ayin Chet. We often take those acrostics and apply ideas to it. So Taf Shin Ayin Chet, friends, may stand for Tehei Shnat Eitz Chaim. May this year be the year of the Tree of Life. The Holocaust Monument is a memorial to those who were slaughtered, but it's also a tree of life. It's a tree of life to those who cleave to it, to our Canadian values, to what we stand for, to a message for generations going forward. May we cleave to that tree of life, and may that truly represent who we are as Canadians, always standing, willing to go to battle for what is right in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi, for your inspiring words and the fascinating evolution of this monument. I would love nothing more than to be able to introduce Laura Grossman. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight, but here's an idea. Why don't we honor her in absentia with some applause, loud enough that she can hear it wherever she is. As we say at the CBC, Yasher Koach, Laura. I'd like to invite Mina Cohn, who's the director of the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship, to introduce the Holocaust Testimonial Project. Mina.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming for this special event. Welcome all, and Shana Tova. The mission of the Center of Holocaust Education and Scholarship is to develop educational programs in order to promote knowledge and understanding of the history and legacy of the Holocaust. We bring together academics, educators, survivors, students, and community members for year-round programming to combat prejudice and racism, to promote respect for diversity, social justice, and human rights. Established less than 2 years ago, the center has experienced a remarkable growth and outreach. From planning Holocaust Education Month programs to developing and presenting various other programs and events, often in cooperation with other institutions. Our first project last summer was dedicated to professionally record film testimonies of 10 Holocaust survivors who live in Ottawa. We are enormously pleased that the premiere screening of the testimonials will be presented here this evening. The project was financed through Carleton University Future Funder and the generosity of many donors, some of whom are with us tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about the project. Realizing that the weight of teaching the Holocaust poses challenges for educators and students alike helped us to focus the rationale for the project. Following a lengthy process of interviews and recordings, the testimonials were edited into 10 30-minute short films designed to be used in a classroom setting. The testimonials cover diverse survival experiences in different parts of Europe, including Nazi slave labor camps and death camps in Poland and Germany, hiding in non-Jewish homes in Holland and France, hiding in a dugout in the Ukraine, surviving ghettos and surviving in safe houses provided by Raoul Wallenberg in Hungary, and surviving as refugees in Romania and Shanghai. Each survivor has a unique and personal story to tell. While many Ottawa survivors have actively participated in telling their stories in a variety of settings, others have never spoken about their experiences before. Recording their stories seemed vital and urgent. In the context of Holocaust education, the voice of a survivor enhances the effectiveness of the learning process and increases historical awareness and understanding. Our hope was that the films would become oral historical resources that will allow future generations of students, researchers, teachers, and others to experience and witness, and others to hear, see, and learn directly from the people who experienced and witnessed the genocidal policies and crimes of the Nazis and their collaborators. Our hope, ladies and gentlemen, has now become a reality. Professors at Carleton University, the University of Ottawa, and teachers in our public school boards are already using the films in their classroom. Additionally, I would like to share with you how thrilled we are that our Survivor Testimonial project has recently been recognized by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and has joined the collection of the National Institute for Holocaust Documentation at the museum. In addition to being available for viewing on the center's website, the Ottawa testimonials can now be accessed by millions of people around the world through the digital library and online archives of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Quite an achievement for a small and young center like us. The survivors' voices, with their unique dignity, carried the memory of the Holocaust in Ottawa and across the nation until now. The recorded testimonials will resonate with us for many years to come and help us not only to remember, but look forward and apply the lessons learned from the survivors. We will now view two excerpts by two child survivors who never spoke before about their experiences. Raoul Korngold shares an incident as a child in hiding in France, recalling an event that happened during 1941, while Cathy Morrison's story happened in Budapest in 1944. The premiere screening of the complete interview with Tova Clark will be shown before we conclude this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mina, and thank you for those moving testimonial films that we will see more of it, as Mina mentioned. It's my pleasure now to introduce our featured speaker for tonight. All but one of the survivors who participated in the testimonial project were children when their lives were turned upside down by the Holocaust. Another one of these child survivors is our keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Robert Krell. Dr. Krell was born in The Hague, Holland, in 1940. He was just 2 years old when he was hidden away to avoid capture and almost certain death by the Nazis. That hiding lasted 3 long years, from 1942 to 1945. Dr. Krell came to Canada in 1951. He obtained his medical degree from the University of British Columbia. After training as a psychiatrist and as a child psychiatrist in the US, he returned to Vancouver and became the Director of Child and Family Psychiatry at the UBC Health Sciences Hospital. He is now Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry. Dr. Krell founded the Vancouver Holocaust Symposium for high school students back in 1976, the Audio-Visual Survivor Testimony Project in 1978, and the Vancouver Holocaust Centre Society in 1984. The Society opened its Holocaust Education Centre in 1994. In the early 1980s, Dr. Krell devoted his time to establishing child Holocaust survivor groups, as well as advocating for child survivors. Dr. Krell actually coined the term child Holocaust survivor, and for his work, he has received the Elie Wiesel Remembrance Award, the Boston Hillel Lifetime Achievement Award, the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal, and the Governor General's Caring Canadian Award. In 2012, he was the keynote speaker at the United Nations International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Dr. Krell's presentation this evening is entitled Reflections on Child Holocaust Survivors, A Personal Perspective. Please welcome Dr. Robert Krell.
Thank you.
Dear friends, on this special occasion, the day of the inauguration of the Holocaust Monument here in the capital of Canada, I have the honor to address you and tell you something about child Holocaust survivors. Any knowledge or expertise I may have derives from being one of these children lucky enough to have survived and to have lived a life denied to so many hundreds of thousands of Jewish youngsters. Some 40 years ago, after a decade of busyness becoming a doctor, psychiatrist, and child psychiatrist, I found my first opportunity to reflect upon and learn a little more about the Shoah. I too had wondered about its uniqueness. After all, war is merciless. World War I was brutal, millions were killed. World War II was brutal, more millions were killed. But this time, there was something fundamentally different. It included a war on unarmed Jewish civilians, nationals of various European countries, and there were no exceptions by age or sex for the slaughter of Jews. Jewish grandmothers were murdered, children hunted to be murdered, and pregnant women, especially pregnant women. Sigmund Freud, whisked away from Vienna to London in 1939 for his safety, thought his 4 older sisters to be safe. After all, they were over 80 years old. All were murdered. Marie died in Theresienstadt, Rosa in Auschwitz, Dolphy and Pauline in Treblinka. Was there any place to hide? Not really. Not from the determined will to annihilate the Jews. Consider what happened to the Jews of Rhodes. Imagine it. The Germans came to Rhodes, a remote island in the Mediterranean, to deport its entire Jewish population, all 1,712 persons. They crammed 550 people into each of 3 small petrol tankers without food. Finally, after 2 days and nights, bread and water were brought on board, and the journey continued for 10 more days to Piraeus. On arrival, they were cruelly beaten, and after 4 days at a detention camp, forced onto trains for a 14-day journey, arriving in Auschwitz on August 16, 1944. The majority were murdered. And of course, I knew that I had been a hunted child who narrowly escaped. I was hidden for 3 years with Dutch Christians. But the world of hiding was small and my understanding limited by my tender years. I could not grasp the enormity of it until many years later. Actually, I could still not understand, although I am now more familiar with that tapestry of horror. 70 years is not historically a long time to gain a measure of perspective. In fact, for the child survivors of the Holocaust, the reality of their survival did not crystallize as a central and formative theme until relatively recently. And that is the essence of my remarks today. What happened to child survivors after the war? What happened to those who had to survive survival as children and adolescents? In 1945, the few remaining Jewish children emerged, some from camps, a larger number from convents and monasteries, attics and cellars, caves and forests, houses and farms. Adults actually argued with children and adolescents about their experiences and memories, both still fresh. They did not really want to hear. The grief of adult survivors powerfully overwhelmed that of the younger survivor. It was more forceful, more public. The older survivors, as well as adults who came to help, including professionals, colluded to tell the children to forget the past and get on with their lives. The advice was well-intentioned. What adults did not realize is that we were different. Most of us grew up overnight. In my writings, I have called us the elderly children. But being told to get on with our lives, to leave the past behind, we did. Child survivors younger than 16 in 1945 embarked upon a life path quite different from those who were about 17 and older. The latter were more likely to have had pre-war memories of family and tradition, of a Jewish education, of shared festive occasions and a weekly Shabbat with parents and grandparents, brothers and sisters. The younger survivors had fewer memories, less Jewish identity, and were dispersed around the globe to those willing to accept them. Whether in orphanages or foster homes, they were more likely to resume schooling, live away from other survivors, and blend within their adoptive communities. The adult survivors, those aged 17 and older at liberation, found their voices earlier, demanded and commanded some attention from the world, and somehow forged ahead even in displaced persons camps to start new families, to grieve and mourn, and to emigrate and find work. But towards children, a damaging attitude prevailed after the war. Surviving children were not considered to have suffered very much, particularly the youngest. Adults who survived the unimaginable torment and suffering with greater comprehension of what was happening assumed that younger children were shielded from the terror. They said to child survivors, "You were so lucky. You probably don't remember anything. You were too young to suffer. Lucky for you not to know." It was an assumption. It was not mean-spirited. The knowledgeable survivors of the worst could not imagine a suffering comparable to theirs. Fair enough. What is more puzzling is the attitude of post-war mental health professionals. Steeped in pre-war psychodynamic theory for decades, they believed that even a single trauma in the developmental years had a strong impact and deserved intensive therapy. But for these children who had endured multiple traumas for years on end, strangely enough, the mental health professionals did not pay much attention. There were few, if any, skilled interviewers to examine the children, listen to their experiences, and attempt to guide them toward health. Of course, there were emergency priorities: food, shelter, the search for family. Yet it took 40 years to begin to listen to the children. Before 1980, child survivors of the Holocaust were rarely heard or noticed. The vast majority lived in silence. Most were saved in hiding, and so they remained. Hiding was difficult during the war, but easy after. Were children unwilling to talk of their experience after the war? It seems not. There were tellers, but no listeners. So we lapsed into silence. We were used to silence. Silence became our language. Given that adults told us we were lucky not to remember, perhaps we should talk a little bit about memory. Mine. I was born on August 5th, 1940, in The Hague, Holland, to Leo and Emmy Krell. The first 2 years of my life are out of my conscious awareness, but in brief, this is what happened. It was dangerous in Nazi-occupied Holland, and no one knew yet what was to come. Within only 2 years, after the imposition of the well-known sanctions and restrictions on Jews, we received papers ordering us to report for, in quotes, resettlement to the east on August 19th, 1942. We fled the house within 1 hour. I was brought to former neighbors while my parents looked for hiding places. My father was hidden in the attic of his furrier partner's home, while my mother lived in a tiny apartment on false papers as a Swiss national. I had the good fortune of having Mrs. Munnick visiting her elderly friends and asking about me. "Oh, that's Rabbi Krell, a Jewish boy, but we can't keep him. His mother is looking for a place to hide him." Mrs. Violetta Munnick, my Christian mother, took me home, and I became Rabbi Munnick. At age 2 1/2, my father visited me one last time. I remember it well, although I could not know it was to be his only visit. He taught me to call him uncle, not dad. In Holland, children called non-relatives uncle if they were close to the family. I was also forbidden to look out the front window to avoid being spotted by a known Dutch Nazi family living kitty corner across the street from us. My hair was dark and curly in a family of blondes. I already knew to stay quiet, not complain, and I never cried. From me, not a word of protest, not a tear shed. I was a good boy. I loved Christmas, for I was allowed to decorate the tree. My Christian sister Nora, who was 10 years older, came home after school and played with me, teaching me to read and write. She almost had all of us killed. One day she took me out in a buggy. I had no idea where we were going. I knew enough to recognize it was dangerous and pulled the blanket over my head. I have that tactile feeling to this day. About 40 years later, I asked Nora about this excursion, and she insisted that it did not happen. Memory. When I told her some details, including a German soldier helping to carry me through a flooded section of town, she admitted that we were going to visit my mother, an address she was not even supposed to know. I asked her, did we make it there? Yes, she answered, we did. She had decided that a baby should see its mother and stuck me out of the house. My mother must have been overjoyed, while petrified with fear, and indeed, that was the day the SS knocked on her door to search her apartment. Apparently, Nora and I cowered under the bed, while my mother somehow gathered the courage to speak her accent in German, explaining she was Swiss, and succeeded to deny access. No wonder I recall the trip there, but little else. Fear erased the rest. When May 5th, 1945 arrived, and we were on the roof cheering British airplanes dropping loaves of white bread on the city, I knew we were free. My parents came to take me home, and I had to leave Mutter, Vater, and Nora. Then I cried for the first time in 3 years. I had to leave my family again. Actually, I howled of protest, of anguish, of rage. I remember it was about 3 years' worth. Liberation for a Jewish child was not particularly liberating. My Jewish parents wisely shared me with my Christian ones, and they became the best of friends. We offered to take in my cousin, Nolly, who chose to stay with his Christian parents. My Aunt Manya had given him to his hiders in 1943, prior to her deportation and murder in Sobibor. So at age 5, I discovered I was a Jew, whatever that meant. Then I began to learn what had happened to Jews. A few survivors returned and told their stories in our living room, in Yiddish. My mother's first cousin had fled to Switzerland and returned with his wife and 8-year-old daughter, Millie. Millie became my translator and best friend. We heard stories no child should ever hear. I cannot forget them. What could we children do with such knowledge? Nolly, age 7, Millie, age 8, and I, age 5. We played as if we were normal. Normal? Nolly was an orphan. Millie's mother had lost her entire family, including 3 sisters and a brother. Her father had lost his parents and his sisters, one of them my mother's best friend. My parents were all alone at ages 32 and 30. My father without his 2 sisters, my mother without her 2 brothers and little sister, all were murdered. I had no grandparents or aunts and uncles. Normal? We were children who escaped death, but we did not escape being enveloped in death and grief and loss. Death was everywhere. I studied Hebrew with a teacher who had been in a concentration camp. Is it any wonder I could not learn from him? 45 years later, I offered my recollections to a writer for a book on hidden children. When my sister Nora read it, she asked where in the world I had gotten my information. So began the dialogue. Nora is 10 years older, speaks many languages, is very bright, and challenged my memories as a 3 to 4-year-old with hers as a 13 to 14-year-old. But there was a problem, both of perception and interpretation, with her memory, not mine. Her recollections are, of course, more vivid. However, there was something wrong. Nora insists to this day, she lives at 87. Nora insists that I played outside during my 3 years with them, that I saw my mother every 2 weeks, and that my life was quite normal. When I asked my mother, then 87, how often she saw me during the war, she replied twice. Once in January 1943, and once in the spring of 1945. Those were her visits to see me at great risk. My visit to her with Nora was described earlier. There were a total of 3 visits within 2.5 years. Nora says every 2 weeks, and all was normal. So my sister and I have conflicting memories. Why is it important to make sense of memory? Because the younger child survivors live memories that are mere fragments. But they are ours. They are important. For some, the fragments contain the last recollections of a mother or father. How does one shape an identity without memory? Nora reassured me that she understood my errors in memory as those of a youngster caught in unusual circumstances, perhaps acquired from the nervousness and tension of the adults around me. But the errors were hers. She needed to normalize the abnormal. How many children actually survived the carnage wreaked by the Germans and their collaborators? In Nazi-occupied countries, 93% of Jewish children were murdered. Of their murders, I cannot speak. Suffice it to say that there were no limits to the sadism of the murderers. None. Only a tiny fraction survived the horrors of the concentration camps. Specifically, genocidal murder demands the deliberate annihilation of children, and as a result, 1.5 million Jewish children and adolescents were slaughtered. There was to be no Jewish future, only a Jewish past. I experienced a life-changing moment at the World Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors in Jerusalem in June 1981. Rabbi Lau, then chief rabbi of Netanya, spoke. My father, the rabbi of Piotrowsk, was murdered at Treblinka. My mother died of hunger at Ravensbrück. I was the youngest survivor of Buchenwald. I was 8 years old. It was as if lightning had struck. He was 8, my cousin Ollie 6, Millie 8, and I was 5. The rabbi's remarks seared into my soul. We were all child survivors. We were the remnants of the destruction. Where were the others? Why did we not hear from them? Of course, there had been pictures in Life magazine of Jewish children arriving in the United States way back in 1946. And Jewish children began to arrive in Canada through the Canadian Jewish Congress-sponsored War Orphans Program. Over 40 settled in Vancouver. There were even some early books. Jack Cooper of Toronto published Child of the Holocaust in 1967. And Saul Friedlander, the brilliant Holocaust historian, published his memoir, When Memory Comes, in 1978. But it became clear to me in 1981 that for the most part, we had been bypassed in the sequence of self-identification. The adult survivors organized themselves as early as the 1950s. In the 1970s, the second generation began to identify itself, strongly inspired by Helen Epstein's Children of the Holocaust, Conversations with the Sons and Daughters of Survivors, published in 1979. But what had happened to us? How had we disappeared? Well, we had taken the advice of our elders. We were far too busy being normal to wish to draw attention to ourselves. Hiding worked, up to a point. Silence, the language of the child survivor, served us well, up to a point. The Krells arrived in Vancouver in 1951. From that moment, I was busy. Busy with school paper routes, working my way through medical school, interned at residency programs in the United States, obtaining Canadian and American medical licensure. You never know when you have to run across a border. The Canadian Fellowship in Psychiatry, the American Boards of Psychiatry and Neurology. There's no problem keeping busy. Where was the Shoah in all this? It was never far away. It was at home in the remarks of my parents. It was in the synagogue where I was surrounded by survivors and their stories and their tears. I loved most of them as if they were family. Some who loved me back had lost their own children. Their wounds were added to my own. The Shoah was in The Hague in 1961 when I visited the Munnichs for the first time since our immigration in 1951. I knocked on their door, but our wartime neighbor opened his and, recognizing me, asked if I had come to visit Moeder. Of course, Mr. de Vries. Of course, I'm here to visit her. He then expressed his disappointment that I had never thanked him for not betraying me. And of course, the Shoah was there in Jerusalem that same summer when my mother's Tante Silke took me to the Eichmann trial. Yes, I saw that little man in the glass booth, the architect of the mass murder of our people. It was a great disappointment to me that he was hanged. I prefer to see him in prison for life with a window overlooking an Israeli kindergarten. My mother and father were at my medical school graduation, and they were at my wedding to Marilyn, where Moeder, who to my knowledge had never spoken publicly, a very, very shy woman, took the microphone and addressed the 400 guests. I translated. Yes, she said, the Holocaust was a great tragedy. She did not understand it, but that nevertheless, she saw it as God's way to give her a son. As she spoke truth, I once asked her, Moeder, did you want my parents to die? Of course, she said. Then you would have been mine. But for your sake, I hope that they would live. When she died, in 1995, I flew to Holland for her funeral and said Kaddish for her. Perhaps I was able to place the Holocaust on hold for brief periods of time. But in the mid-70s, with 3 colleagues and Canadian Jewish Congress Pacific Region, we founded in 1976 the Holocaust Symposium for high school students that continues to this day. What is it? It will be our 42nd? 42nd this year. And in 1981, Having attended that world gathering that I talked about and realizing the absence of children from the Holocaust survivor agenda, I felt a special responsibility. While on sabbatical at UCLA in 1982, I heard Sarah Moskowitz, a developmental psychology professor at Cal State Northridge, speak of her book on child survivors, titled Love Despite Hate, Child Survivors of the Holocaust and Their Adult Lives, to be published in 1983. So I heard her in 1982, received the draft, then it was published in 1983. This fascinating account of 24 children found at Terezin and brought to Lingfield, England for their recovery, required her to travel the world interviewing all 24 children fully 35 years later as adults. Sarah committed herself to forming a child survivor group in Los Angeles. I attended the founding meeting. The project failed to gain momentum, and in 1983, at Sarah's request, I spoke to a group of child survivors gathered at the University of Judaism in Los Angeles about our need to be together, to end our aloneness, and to begin to share our lives, successes, and problems with others of similar backgrounds. Several stepped forward to lead the group that soon grew to 300 members. Abe Foxman, recently retired executive director of the Anti-Defamation League, was a hidden child. His parents returned for him, and he was the subject at age 5 of a protracted custody battle between his parents and his Polish rescuer. I helped convince him to put the prestige of his organization behind the proposed first international gathering of child survivors of the Holocaust held in 1991 in New York, titled the ADL Hidden Child Conference. I invited Elie Wiesel to be the closing speaker, and he agreed. This gathering attracted over 1,600 participants, primarily child survivors, who talked with each other for the first time about the complexities and the mysteries of our lives, and they did so in workshop and plenary formats. It signaled our arrival, and every year we have gathered in places like Los Angeles, Houston, Montreal, Detroit, Toronto, Warsaw, Prague, Washington, D.C., Seattle, Denver, Amsterdam, even Berlin, and twice in Jerusalem. This November, we return to Jerusalem. And what do we talk about when we meet? What are the themes that connect us so profoundly? I shall discuss only a few very briefly. I've alluded to fragmented memories. The younger children, bereft of sufficient memories to recapture, are most prone to a fragile and tenuous sense of identity. Persecuted for being a Jew, few of us had any sense of what it was to be a Jew. The older children with some memory of Jewish tradition had to lie about their origins in order to survive, but also had something to retrieve after liberation. And therefore, discussions of identity predominate. Who returned to Judaism and how was it done? What happened to their Christian cover? In my workshops at annual gatherings, I have met Jewish children who may have become traditional or even observant Jews, but who never miss attending a Christmas Mass. Have I mentioned that we live with rage? How could it be otherwise? When everything is taken, when an outrage is committed that lasted as long as 6 years for some, what are the possible responses? I know mine. And some live with shame, one that is undeserved, for we did nothing wrong. But it is the fate of children to internalize responsibility for much of what is done by adults. Perhaps we deserved our fate for not behaving well enough. In conversation and discussions with other child survivors, it is evident that most convert their rage into constructive actions. Some are artists, writers, teachers, healers. Many have turned to Holocaust education. I know of no robbers, thieves, or killers. Of the 1,000 children discovered at Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, 426 went to a Écouis, an abandoned sanatorium near Paris, placed at the disposal of the OSE, the French Children's Rescue Society. Approximately 90 children and adolescents were transferred to the beautiful castle of Amvlois under the care and direction of Judith Hemmendinger and a young counselor, Nini Cohen. This particular group of youngsters had demanded kashrut. They wished to return to a traditional religious life based on their memories of pre-war life. Early on, the hundreds of boys were gathered at Écouis and addressed by either a psychologist or a psychiatrist and told that they would never recover. I cannot imagine it, but this I was told by several boys. In fact, the French government did not want to spend too much money on rehabilitation because in the first place they felt that these children were irremediable psychopaths. Who else but the worst could have survived? Or so went their reasoning. And secondly, being so malnourished and weak, surely they would have a brief lifespan and die young. Why invest monies? Therein lies the real story, the story of recovery, of the resilience of children, of the courage to pursue education, of a career, of the eagerness to embrace life and opportunity. The vast majority raised families, held jobs, and contributed to their communities. Israel Meyer Lau, the 8-year-old Lulek, became the chief rabbi of the state of Israel. And Menashe Klein, a rabbinic leader with a huge following. There were physicians. There were businessmen, including the late George Goldblum of Miami and our own Robbie Weisman of Vancouver. Two became prominent physicists, including Kalman Kulligstein, who worked with Albert Einstein. Elie Wiesel, child survivor and resident at Amvlois, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and Naftali Lavie, Rabbi Lau's older brother, served as Israel's consul general to New York. The story is one of inspiration and tragedy, for these young survivors not only demonstrated a capacity to recapture life and live it fully, but accentuated the tragedy of all those young lives lost. Youngsters who also had the potential to become rabbis, professionals, and artists. The music not written, the medicines not discovered, the wisdom not acquired and shared. I think often about those unlived lives. The savagery and sadism visited upon Jews by a modern nation and its collaborators may defy imagination but not reality. And I know we're often considered to be irritants, we survivors, and I am glad to see we have a new irritant, Laura Grossman. We're irritating to some. I'm not sure that they wouldn't rather have us not around, because we know the best and the worst of Christianity. My Christian rescuers have more to teach about kindness and compassion than the thousands of European clergy who turned their backs on us. We know and remember what it meant to be turned away from the shores of the United States and Canada and from the oft-promised Jewish homeland by the British. Hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved. So we are irritants, the living reminders of injustice that has not yet really been rectified. If it is our fate to live as reminders, so be it. We're no longer allowed the luxury of silence, although we cherish silence and find comfort in it. By breaking that silence and sharing memory, perhaps we can together still create a better future. The presence of the memorial inaugurated today will serve as a reminder not only of what occurred, but what remains to be done. Canada is now on the map of Holocaust memory, a building block to awareness of what is possible when a society fails to value and protect its citizens. I hope that your children and grandchildren, as well as mine, will draw from the survivors' experiences the inspiration to live life fully, to value perseverance in face of great obstacles, and to never despair. It is easy for a Jew to fall victim to despair, for our future is still not secure. But one of the children of Buchenwald, the late Elie Wiesel, spent a lifetime reminding us that Jews are forbidden to despair. We're commanded to hope and to dream, and so are you.
I'd like to invite Dr. Jan Grabowski to come up to deliver the closing remarks. Dr. Grabowski is a professor of history of the Holocaust at the University of Ottawa. He's also a founding member of the Polish Center for Holocaust Research in the Polish Academy of Sciences. He's authored and edited 15 books and published more than 60 articles in English, French, Polish, German, and Hebrew. Professor Grabowski's most recent book is Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-Occupied Poland. Dr. Grabowski is also a member of the advisory board of the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship, and I had the good fortune to hear his address at the JCC a few months ago, talking about, I think it's the Polish Blue Police. Fascinating lecture. Thank you. Please welcome Dr. Grabowski.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation and for this wonderful ambiance today that we could share. I promise to be extremely brief, basically a few summing remarks and a few words of warning, because usually the message I give is not all that optimistic. The people who study and who educate about the Shoah, who want to preserve the memory of the victims, have become today custodians of more and more elusive truths, with the voice of survivors becoming less and less audible, with the relentless march of time, with the arrival of era of post-truths, where outrageous falsifications of history no longer trigger widespread indignation, nor they carry a stigma of shame. It's incumbent upon us to state and restate the case, to reaffirm the value and the weight of the testimony of survivors, lest we all forget. In addition to the testimony of survivors, we need to reaffirm the testimony of non-survivors, their letters, diaries, last desperate pleas, and unanswered questions. After all, the experience of the Holocaust is not one of survival, it is an experience of unsurvival. There are fewer and fewer issues of the past which a majority of people know about, at least in some detail. We are entering an ahistorical revolution where the preoccupation with the present presents a threat to our understanding of the past. In this growing historical vacuum, where other elements of collective memory have faded, the importance of the Holocaust has increased. The extreme character of the Shoah lends itself well to metaphorical use, the more so as society requires a real metaphor of absolute evil. Despite the fact that the memory of the Holocaust can be considered today one of the few common, shared, most tragic, and universally accepted legacies of the whole humanity, the challenges are many and they are becoming more and more pervasive. Today, when we hear from prominent politicians that the lesson of Auschwitz is, I quote, not to admit refugees, when prominent politicians deliver speeches in Auschwitz without ever even once mentioning the word Jew, when the memory of the Holocaust is used, abused, and assailed in order to seek own national edification and gratification, all of this leaves no room for complacency. It is again the time when one needs to make the Holocaust testimonies known as widely as possible. It's the time for us to seek answers why ordinary people like me, like you, can commit unspeakable acts. It is ordinary individuals who commit extraordinary evil. Perpetrators of extraordinary evils are extraordinary only by what they have done, not by who they are or who they were. It is time to reflect over and over again upon the indifference of the masses, on the indifference of the millions who stood by and through their inaction contributed to the horrors of the past. It's time to think about the case, about the ease with which ordinary people espouse the messages of hate and believe that different means alien, that alien means hostile, and that hostiles requires radical action. I would like to express to all people of goodwill who devoted their time, energy, and thoughts to make this event possible my greatest and most profound thanks. Thank you.
One final speaker to wrap up the evening, Professor Deidre Butler, the head of the Zelikovic Center at Carleton University.
I will be brief as well. Thank you all for coming. Shana Tova. When I teach about the Canadian Jewish community, one of the things that strikes my students is the role of Holocaust survivors. The Canadian Jewish community is strong today because of the work that was done by Holocaust survivors to build the infrastructure of our communities, to build our schools, to build our synagogues, to build all of our communal institutions. They have carried the weight for our community. When I think about chess, and I think about everything that Mina and her committee has done, they are survivors, and they are the children of survivors. And they have carried the weight of this work, and I thank them. Thank you all. When we began this project of starting the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship 2 years ago, Mina sat at my table, and I said yes, because you can't say no to Mina. And we brought together the resources of Carleton and the resources of this incredible committee and their will and their work to do something to remember the Holocaust, to honor those who were lost, to honor the survivors, and to hear their voices, to educate. This was done without a penny from Carleton, and without a penny to start. And it was made possible by donors. Many of you are sitting in this room. You have made all of the programs possible, including tonight, for the last 2 years. So I ask for us all to help share this task together and contribute, if you can, support, if you can, the work that's done by this center. And hopefully we can take this work forward for many years to come. Thank you all so much for coming tonight and for making tonight such a meaningful event. Thank you to our speakers and for the important words that were spoken here today. Mina, thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you very much, Deidre. And thank you, Professor Grabowski, for your insightful words. Please note that inside the center's brochure, you can find the full schedule of events for Holocaust Education Month. It starts in November of this year, and the organizers look forward to seeing you at these events. The hour is late, but I would ask you to give me 1 or 2 minutes for a personal statement, if I may. Last week, we lost a 95-year-old Holocaust survivor. She was my mother-in-law, Bella Mercer. She came from the Polish village of Szczebrzeszyn. She was 17 years old when German troops entered her town. They stayed a few days and then vanished to be replaced by Russian troops. And the Russians told my mother-in-law to get her family. Her father had died a few years earlier. Her mother was disabled. She had 3 siblings, to get them all to the train station where a train would take them to Russia and to safety. And somehow she got them there, and somehow she found work in Russia. She got food for her family and managed to help them all survive. She was what one nurse at the Montreal Jewish General described as a tough cookie, and she certainly was. She was stubborn as can be. That was a survival skill that she developed during the war. So I'd like to pay tribute to my mother-in-law and to all the Holocaust survivors who have made such a difference by surviving and sharing their stories with us. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you found the evening as moving and informative as I did. Thank you, Shana Tova, good night, and safe driving.